want to start with some questions about the beginning of your career, because the earliest stuff I found was a senior designer, and I was like, maybe Cardell went in some gaming university, got his gaming design PhD, and then right away he got a senior designer position. So I'm messing with you. Everybody knows there's no education in video games. You kind of figure out on your own. So
You
tell
fall
me
out
your
of the
story.
tree. Yeah. So it's actually pretty funny looking back. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in science. I was focused on cell molecular biology, and I had a minor in psychology. So I would actually work. I was working on a few different ways to potentially cure skin cancer or just general cancer. Now,
Skin cancer, video games.
Right, yeah, exactly. Don't get me wrong. This is a quality intro in some ways, because no one else in the group wanted to be the lead system designer, because they didn't want to deal with management and report. And for me, I was like, well, ironically, like I'm slightly older than all of you, and I'm taller than all of you, so I might as well be the person who's in charge, because clearly height is how decisions are made nowadays, and I don't really know why that is. And
I know biology, and it's very important.
Exactly. I know biology. I'm tall.
Kind of psychology. It's kind of close.
Right. My jump shot's okay. Like clearly, it's all like we're all right. Like we can do this. It'll be fine. So that's how I became the systems lead, and that was my very first taste of what it was to actually try to lead a team while at the same time making creative decisions and being an individual contributor. So that was wild.
Okay.
That was wild. So we're working on Asheron's Call 2, which is the sequel, and this project is way behind in terms of budget, in terms of time started, in terms of the schedules. Again, looking back on it now, I can only laugh because they were so wildly behind. But I spent most of my time along with a few other people. We spent the first 3 months of when we first started just crunching consistently. And no one asked us to. We just looked at this and we're like, there's no world that this can be done unless we do this. Because most systems, you build most system design, it's like the first thing in the funnel. Because then you have to actually, like, an example would be like a combat equation that allows to, if you're playing a role-playing game, it's like, this is the percentage chance of you hitting someone. Once you write that spec, then someone has to make that system. Then someone gets to then playtest that system. And therefore, by the time you're at the point of playtesting, you want to be building a bunch of other stuff, not trying to write other baseline systems. Like, so your systems come in first and everything else typically follows. So we crunched for almost 3 months before it was even asked of us. And then ironically, I think the rest of the company began to realize that they would need to crunch as well. So then they instituted a mandatory crunch. And this kind of shows how far I guess I've come. Because I was a very, very salty youngster, I think, looking back on it. That was the first day that, like, all of us went home early. We went home on a normal day because we're like, we've been crunching for 3 months. It's cool that everyone's going to start. We're going to get 1 day normal, and then we're gonna head back in. So I would say that was actually one of the biggest informers for me on why crunch culture is bad, because it fragmented us as a team, and it fragmented us in ways that wasn't really healthy. And it definitely had a lot of issues that, like, again, and looking back on it, I'm just like, this should have been done better. And I've tried to apply that in every single leadership role I've had since then. I'm trying to find a better way to either inform crunch or to rotate crunch, other ways that you can allow, but only when it absolutely has to happen. And then even when it does happen, you don't sacrifice quality or other people's personal lives to the degree that they are just losing, losing large swaths of their reasons to even come to work anymore. You can't just heads down and pretend that your team will manage itself. If anything, I would say your number 1 job is to manage your team. Your number 2 job is individual contribute. And that means that you can recognize that effectively you're working 2 separate jobs, which is basically what I ended up doing, which was the first half of the day was mostly just management. And the second half of the day was me trying to do my individual contribution. And that only works if you're working 14 hours, roughly.
People choose to work for people that they look up for, and there's something that they look up for when they work with you. And so whatever example you do, they're going to follow. So if there is just from a friend to friend, if you really want them to stop crunching and work less, you can only lead by example.
Right.
I gave up on that. I'm like, But last 2 months, I've been mandatory 6:30 p.m. No working.
Okay.
Like I shut down my computer. I still think like as a
Right.
leader,
Yes.
like you cannot switch off this thing. And my husband
Yes.
would be having a dinner and be like calculating something in my head. So, but I just started working at like around 6 a.m. So it's still like good 12 and a half hours of work. Okay. So design, you became a leader. There's two things that, didn't work. What else didn't work? Like if somebody is new in a producer role, which I don't know, like people who are trying to go into management just don't. It's terrible work. Never gonna get a knowledge, nothing. Just forget about it. But if people have decided they're gonna go and, be producers, right? And dedicate and devote their life into helping other people. Again, that they will never acknowledge. What are the other things that what are the other things that you like is a no-no, right, from your career?
So I would say motivated thinking is perhaps the biggest problem that people have when they try to go into a leadership role. And by motivated thinking, I mean, I'm going to be like this when I'm leading this team, or this team needs this as a guarantee and I'm going to provide it. Like the reality there is like you try to move as much of yourself as you can comfortably so you can actually get an accurate layout of the land. Because a team's problems from the outside are wildly different than a team's problems from the inside. And though they might present similar ways, you need to actually be dispassionate enough to see what's there. Because like the way I look at it is typically leaders really only get a few chances to enact effective change. After that, what ends up happening is you effectively become part of the inner circuitry of your team, and it becomes very hard to diagnose again. Because from the outsider coming in, everything's fresh and new, so you're actually just kind of asking people what do people do and taking them at face value. Once you're in the inside, you know how the sausage is made, which means that even when a person tells you something, you know enough to know they're maybe not being 100% truthful. So,
or they're not even aware.
Or they're not even right.
That's
yes.
the worst thing when like people are telling you and you're like, hey, but and they're like not aware. You're like, they're no,
yes,
right here.
Absolutely. And it's like they're like, I never did that. And it's like you've done this 3 times in this meeting. Like I don't know what to tell you. Like it's clear to me and everyone else here that you lack credibility in this one. And I don't think you're malicious and I don't think you're a liar. I just think you're not aware. And like that's one of those things that's very, very dangerous. And then higher up in the organization you go, the more I feel you have to be open to the fact that, I mean, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility is the best way of putting it. Like for making any decision at all, like if you're a leader, it doesn't really matter how you got there. What matters is where you're going next. Like that's the thing which you need to consider pretty consistently, because you gain nothing by wringing your hands or being frustrated and angry. Like sure, those things can maybe help you feel better. I probably do. Like they help us all feel better, I suppose. But like that's not going to help your team. Like you still need your team to follow you and trust you and provide information to you. Some of which is very important, some of which you didn't even think was important until they say it. Like it's like so that's a big one. I think another big one that I think as a leader is like, hey, what you did before you became a leader, depending on the size of your team, you need to learn to let that go. And like this is the lesson I learned in the second stage of my time at Turbine, because at first I was as a systems lead, I was still doing systems, but when I became a design director, I then had a team of about 12 people underneath me, and at 12 people with 12 direct reports, like I have no time to do systems anymore. I mean, that was the reason I loved doing design work, was building systems, but all I could really do then was pitch systems or write systems, and I realized that was just frustrating to me and my designers, because I'm writing a half-formed series of ideas and I'm not involved in any of the meetings where a person has to take those ideas over the finish line. So they would make decisions that I wasn't a part of. And then you're stuck as the person in charge being like, do you support your team showing volition and initiative? Or do you instead chastise them for not doing it like you would have done it if you were in the room? And like, there are times where both can apply. I mean, there really are. I mean, like, but the sad fact is like, you need to recognize like you never, like basic psychological, like statement, you never punish a behavior you want to see more of. Like, just don't. Like, that's just the worst thing you could ever do. Because like, if you actually want people to take more initiative and take more ownership, don't punish them when they take ownership. Like you can basically say, hey, this thing, you can get them to commit to things that are supposed to be outputs of their ownership, and then say you missed those things, but don't punish the fact that they saw a problem, they tried to fix it. Because the instant you start doing that, that's the instant your ship starts taking on leaks, and everyone else is waiting for someone else to fix them, because they've learned that taking the initiative is just going to be met with punishment or skepticism or some mixture of those two things.
You know, when you were a design director,
Mm-hmm.
it probably, I mean, go through your career where
Sure.
you provide half-baked ideas and then let people go and like developing them, and then they come back
Yes.
and you're like,
Yep. Yeah.
there,
So,
as my husband says, there are smarter ways to do that.
yes.
You know.
Yeah. Yes.
So how
yes.
how do you manage that? Can we do a quick 101?
Sure. So, so the way I learned through, as you stated, like the game development tree is you fall out of the tree, hitting every branch in the way, and you learn lessons. I don't know if I've hit bottom yet, but I do feel like I'm hitting branches less often, but the branches I hit are much sturdier. so like at the time, I learned that, you know, I have a system design team that I've literally worked with almost the entire time. I made a couple hires. They were both very, very, very high quality hires. One of whom went on to be the creative director of Fortnite. Great, wonderful team. I realized that like you need to stop worrying about this team and start worrying about the other sides of design. Because as a system designer, of course I had more opinions about systems than I had about content or world. But as a design director, I have to care about all of it. Like this is the whole thing. Like the entire thing is your team. And therefore, you know, I owe it to that team to pay as much attention to probably more attention to the other ones, because it's harder for me to digest them because I didn't have as much experience, and they wasn't as recent. So
can you, for somebody who's watching it and doesn't know the difference between like system design
Sure.
and design and systems and any
Right.
other, and also I always say that every single company has it done differently.
Yes,
so
absolutely. Yeah. So I guess the way I'll summarize it is system designs are whenever you're designing something that is largely programmatic content. So like AI behaviors, classes and class skills, some cases even UI, social systems like guilds or grouping. Like those are mostly systems for system design. Now for content design, specifically for this one, as a design director, this was Lord of the Rings Online. So content design is like all the epic quests. Every time, you know, you want to have Gandalf around, every time you want to write backstory for a certain region of the world. So, you know, you're building the North Downs, you're building the Shire, you're adding these quests into their activities, and all of that is all part of content design. Like those are people that are designing quests, and whether that be a simple basic, you know, deliver mail to this Hobbit's mailbox quest, or whether that be literally, you know, fight your way down into the bowels of Moria and defeat the, you know, the remnants of the Balrog. Like those are both content design. And then world design is executing the actual level layout and feel of any aspect of the world that, you know, that it needs to be built. So in some cases that is literally just populating the Shire with houses and mailbox and those assets and figuring out what is needed to actually sell those regions, all the way to, you know, looking at Rivendell and being able to say like, okay, Rivendell should look like this based off the book, and working with the art team to try to figure out, like, give them enough room so they can express themselves, while at the same time you actually have enough space to be able to handle gameplay needs. So it's actually more like the design of space is probably the best way I feel of handling that. Space and lighting.
So it seems like your team were half creative writers and half technical systems designers, which are two different parts of the brain. How did that work under one roof?
Badly. The example which I'd use for this one is one of the biggest problems we had in building Lord of the Rings Online was the number of quests. Like we knew we wanted to have thousands of quests, but that meant that everyone just wanted to throw down their hands and just make as many quests as they possibly could, which I totally understand. Like, you know, you feel the burn, you feel like there's something that needs to be done as quickly as possible. But the reality is that sometimes you're going to save a crap ton more time if you're actually just very, very solid around these are the types of quests we're going to build. And then you invest in tooling to make those quests being able to be built faster. Now, they had no desire to do that initially. Every quest had to be unique and special. And because every quest had to be unique and special, every quest was super brittle and required a lot of engineering to work, and often couldn't be reused. So the very first thing I did when I became the design director was I sat down with a few different people, told them to give me all their quests. And then I just looked at them all and systemized them. And it was basically like, these are the 8 archetypes of quests we have in our game. 80% of them should be from the first 5. And then you can do 20% of the advanced 3. And the first 5 were very basic. They were like collect, kill, go to a location, kind of things that are fairly standard for most RPGs, but you can actually build a fairly compelling story out of them as long as there's an interesting journey along the way. And the other ones that were actually more complex were like point defenses, escort quests, instances where you have to go into we instance the world and like tell you a different story there. Like those ones are always very, very expensive, but they're great. I mean, they're really good, but you actually want to use them somewhat sparingly. And they hated it. Like the content team hated it with a fire of 1,000 suns. The games that were already big are winning bigger. And the games that are new are just harder to make. Like, it's just like, because I don't know about you, but I've seen so many different delays over the last 6 months. And like, we worked really hard to make sure that we weren't one of them. And it required a lot of what I talked about before. Like, you kind of have to sit down and look at the problems you're facing and drive to a logical conclusion that everyone can put their hands in a circle on and agree. Because if you come up with a solution that other people don't want to do, it probably won't work. So, it needs to be something that everyone understands the reasoning behind and the consequences for failing to succeed at. And once that happens, it is much easier to be able to drive like bonus points if you can find a metric that you can track as it's going on. So you can tell people, look how far we've come, look at what your contribution has done here. But like, that's just a thing that's kind of like a feel-good metric, but it's also a way of tracking your, how close you are to success based off of your previous definitions.
Do you have any of those with your teams, or have you had that with like systems design or design in general? Or
So what we actually did, again, I'll use the LOTRO equivalents because it's probably it's the most relevant to the stuff I was just talking about. We, as I mentioned before, we were a very anti-crunch team, and we tried our best to make sure we didn't really have to crunch. But we did eventually get to the point where I was like, well, if we're going to ask people to do extra time, this is the time to do it, because the game was baked. It was fun. We thought it was fun. We had a lot of good alpha feedback, and in general, the team was excited. So what we ended up doing actually was we did this is a fairly mercenary approach, and I'm just cautioning you on this one.
Okay.
The mercenary approach here was we let all of our seniors propose what they could spend their time on. And we vetted it as a leadership team, trying to make sure that like, oh, does this solve a player problem? Like whatever. It didn't really matter what they proposed, as long as we felt it was scalable and achievable within their time frame. And then from there, from the juniors and some of the mids, it was like they effectively had bug quotas. And the goal was like, we are trying to get to ZBR. Everyone here is adding to the quality by fixing bugs, which is imminently trackable. Everyone above the line is adding these, effectively we call them speclets of because they're not quite specs, but they were like little lightweight specs. They're adding avenues of quality to the game that we didn't think we would ever have time to fix or finish, and it allowed them to effectively own those portions and make those portions better. And it allowed us to basically track the number of speclets we'd implemented and the number of bugs we were kind of driving towards, which allowed us to be like, this is how much time and energy we have spent grinding these things out. Like getting to 0 bugs reproduced, everyone does that. But the speclet side was actually much more fascinating to people because they got to see all these little things that people were adding, up to and including like cosmetic inventory changes, new skills, like all like new common skills, new revamped traits, like all these things that we just didn't have time to build, but suddenly we were building. And it was a really good feeling because it was actually driven from more of the bottom up. And like, if you have a healthy team, you'll feel changes be driven from the bottom up. And you'll actually agree with those changes because you're like, this is actually solving a problem, which I've told the team we have. Versus if you're spending all your time trying to stop your team from driving change from the bottom up, something's wrong. Either you're not being clear about the problem, or your team something wrong in your team. Like maybe they don't believe in the problem, or maybe there's some ego drive there that's causing other problems to kind of like surface. But like that was probably that was the first time I'd ever gone through a crunch on a project that felt as successful as it was.
The worst one is if they don't care. Like that's
yes, that is the worst. And like, I guess that's to an extent, like this is my mercenary portion of it. If you don't care, then I'm going to give you a bug quota because like I can track this. Like we used to actually have, we have these Amazon gifts, which we would give out to people internal to the team. And there was one that was called the big ball of blame and the big ball of guilt. And our running joke was always that if you're susceptible to guilt, you're probably not susceptible to blame, and vice versa. Because like if you're the type of person who works because of the fact you feel guilty about, oh my God, I'm missing all these things, being blamed for something doesn't really bother you that much, because the fact that, you know, like you already feel guilty about everything you need to get done, and you'll never be not guilty because there's always more work to be done. If on the other hand, you don't feel guilt about not doing extra work, then blame is all you really have, because then it's like well, this is the amount of work that's expected of you. I need you to find a way to do that. And you know, you set those quotas in a way that's humane for people, obviously, but at least it allows you to have a project that not everyone has to be like super excited for in some ways, but still capable of contributing to.